webinar brought to you by the ABA Section of Civil Rights and Social Justice and the ABA Standing Committee on Election Law. And this program is part of our ongoing commitment to provide insightful discussions on critical issues. And how timely is today's discussion? And so we encourage you to visit our website for future updates. I've got some slides to share that say a lot of that. So let's pull those up right now, shall we? Okay. Okay. Let's go with this. All righty. So again, this is today's webinar, the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, a practical perspective, discussion on election administration and citizen enfranchisement. And again, we're thrilled to present it. And for future programming and such, please visit the websites of the two sponsoring groups, the Standing Committee on Election Law and the Section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. Little housekeeping here, some ground rules. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions through the Q&A function, not the chat. If you do not see the controls, please, move your cursor around, ensure your screen is not idle. And we will be monitoring the Q&A and we'll do our best to address as many questions as possible, time permitting. I think we will be taking questions at the end of our prepared programs. A recording of this program will be shared with all registrants, so please feel free to distribute that among your networks. Now, I am pleased to introduce my fellow panelists. First is Patty Ferguson Bonney, Associate Dean for Inclusive Excellence, the Charles M. Brewer Professor of Trial Advocacy, the Faculty Director of the Indian Legal Program, and the Director of the Indian Legal Clinic. All of that at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at beautiful Arizona State University. She's also an attorney with the firm of Sachs Tierney. Also, Jennifer Morell, the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of the Elections Group. She's a former election official in both Utah and in Colorado, and she's an adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs. And I am your moderator and panelist, William Kresse. I am a commissioner with the Chicago Board of Election Commissioners. I am an associate professor at the College of Business at Governor State University in University Park, Illinois, where I specialize in auditing and fraud examination. I am president of the Institute of Election Auditors, and I am proud to say a recipient of the ABA's Unsung Heroes of Democracy Award. So, a little legal disclaimer with all these attorneys here. The following presentation is intended for educational purposes only. Any materials and any comments made by any of the panelists does not necessarily reflect the positions or opinions of any of the organizations of which any of them are affiliated. So there. Okay. So today's program deals with the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, also known as the SAVE Act. Well, what exactly is it? Well, it was, or it is, House Resolution 22, HR 22, recently reintroduced in the U.S. House of Representatives. It's currently before the House Committee on House Administration, and at last count has 54 sponsors. And here is the summary, which is included at the beginning of the bill. The bill requires individuals to provide documentary proof of U.S. citizenship when registering to vote in federal elections. Specifically, the bill prohibits states from accepting and processing an application to register to vote in a federal election unless the applicant presents documentary proof of U.S. citizenship. The bill specifies what documents are considered acceptable proof of U.S. citizenship. Furthermore, the bill prohibits states from registering an individual to vote in a federal election unless, at the time that the individual applies to register to vote, The individual provides documentary proof of U.S. citizenship and requires states to establish an alternative process under which an applicant may submit other evidence to demonstrate U.S. citizenship. Continuing, each state must take affirmative steps on an ongoing basis to ensure that only U.S. citizens are registered to vote, which shall include establishing a program to identify individuals who are not U.S. citizens using information supplied by certain sources. Additionally, states must remove non-citizens from their official list of eligible voters. The bill allows for a private right of action against an election official who registers an applicant to vote in a federal election but fails to present documentary proof of U.S. citizenship. And the bill establishes criminal penalties against an election official for certain offenses, including registering an applicant to vote in a federal election who fails to present documentary proof of U.S. citizenship. So, what exactly do they mean by documentary proof of U.S. citizenship? Well, Section 2A2 of SAVE states that, number one, an ID issued consistent with the requirements of the Real ID Act of 2005. Okay, many of you may have those. Get it from very often, you get your driver's license and you bring in certain proofs, you can get a real ID, driver's license or state ID. Also, a valid U.S. passport. Also, a U.S. military ID card combined with a U.S. military record of service that shows that the applicant's place of birth was within the United States. Also, a valid government-issued photo ID issued by a federal, state, or tribal government showing that the applicant's place of birth was in the United States. And 5, a valid government-issued photo ID issued by a federal, state, or tribal government other than any of those I just listed, but only if presented with one or more of the following. And this is where the fun begins. Okay? So these would be the Section 2A2 Part 5 required documents. A certified birth certificate. So if you have for example, a driver's license that's not a real ID, you bring in the driver's license, but you also have to bring in a certified birth certificate issued by a state, local government in a state or a tribal government, which was issued by those in which the applicant was born, was filed with the office responsible for keeping vital records in that state, which includes the full name, date of birth, and place of birth of the applicant, lists the full name of one or both of the applicant's parents, has the signature of an individual who was authorized to sign birth certificates on behalf of the state, unit of government, tribal government where the applicant was born, includes the date that the certificate was filed with the office responsible for keeping vital records of the state, and number 7, has the seal of the state, the local government, or tribal government that issued the birth certificate. Okay, so those are requirements for bringing in a birth certificate along with that otherwise government-issued ID. But instead of a birth certificate, you could also have an extract from a United States hospital record of birth created at the time of the applicant's birth, which indicates the applicant's place of birth was in the United States, or a final adoption decree showing the applicant's name and that the applicant's place of birth was in the United States, or a consular report of birth abroad of a citizen of the United States, or a certification of the applicant's report of birth of a United States citizen issued by the Secretary of State, or a naturalization certificate or certificate of citizenship issued by the Secretary of Homeland Security, or any other document or method of proof issued by the Secretary of Homeland Security or any other document, excuse me, I lost track there, proof of United States citizenship issued by the federal government pursuant to the Immigration and Naturalization Act, Ooh, and an American Indian card issued by the Department of Homeland Security with the classification KIC. Um, uh-oh, I have a Zoom control in front. Does that help if I move that off? Okay. Um, okay. Let me get rid of that. Pow. All right. Sorry about that, folks. Okay. Some other okay. Bottom right also. Well, I don't know where that's going on. So I apologize if you can't see the whole document. Um, I'm going to have to continue. I don't see how this is going wrong. One moment. Let me make sure I got everything good here. Uh, okay. Okay. All good now. Okay. I'm all good now. All right. Very good. All right. General requirements. Okay. For registering to vote, that the voter present citizenship documents. So Section 2B of SAVE states, and I quote, under any method of voter registration in a state, the state shall not accept and not process an application to register to vote in an election for federal office unless the applicant presents documentary proof of U.S. citizenship with the application. So your election authorities cannot even accept the application, and certainly not process them unless you bring in that proof with you. Okay. Um, so let's look at specific other areas of that. That's the general rule. Now, what about applying, registering when you're applying for a driver's license, as was allowed under the Motor Voter Act? So Section 2C amends the National Voter Registration Act of 1993 to include a requirement that the voter registration applicant provides documentary proof of United States citizenship. So, Motor Voter Act, again, have to bring in that proof of citizenship. What about the National Mail Voter Registration Form? Okay. Section 2D of the SAVE Act amends Section 6 of the National Voter Registration Act such that it replaces the Federal Election Commission, which is the agency that's named in the National Voter Registration Act. It replaces them with the Election Assistance Commission as the responsible federal agency for developing the mail voter registration forms, etc. It requires that each state's chief election official to, quote, take such steps, end quote, to ensure that residents are aware of the requirement to provide documentary proof of U.S. citizenship to register to vote. Probably a good idea. In fact, before someone applying by mail can be registered, they must present U.S. citizenship documents in person to the appropriate election official office by the deadline for registration. Okay, you have to provide the documents in person if you're registering by mail. Or in those states, such as I'm here in Illinois, in states that have same day polling place registration and voting, the applicant must present U.S. citizenship documents to the election official at the polling place itself. Okay. Then, continuing with this same section, upon receiving an otherwise completed appropriate mail voter registration application form, that appropriate election official shall transmit a notice to the applicant of the requirement to present documentary proof of U.S. citizenship along with how-to instructions. So when the official gets that registration, that mail registration in the mail, they then have to inform that voter how to bring in or otherwise their documentary proof. Then each state, in consultation with the EAC, shall ensure that reasonable accommodations are made um, to any individual with a disability who submits an appropriate mail registration application form to present documentary proof of U.S. citizenship to the official. Doesn't go into details as to suggestions to how this person with a disability will be able to present that, but that's in the SAVE Act. Okay, the SAVE Act also places certain requirements on election officials and election agencies. Section 2E states that voter registration agencies are required to ask each applicant the question, are you a citizen of the United States? If the applicant answers in the affirmative, okay, they then require documentary proof of U.S. citizenship prior to even providing the appropriate application form. Frankly, not a bad idea, only because in the very few cases I've seen in Illinois, we've had situations where at the DMV, for whatever reason, non-citizens were signed up. In fact, I can only think of 2 instances where that happened. I can talk about those later. So ask first. Good idea. All right. Section 2F. Subject to any relevant guidance from the EAC, again, that's the Election Assistance Commission, each state shall establish a process under which an applicant who cannot provide documentary proof of U.S. citizenship may register. Aha! So, if you don't have that documentary proof, here's the loophole, right, in which they can still register. But wait. The applicant must sign an attestation under penalty of perjury that the applicant is a U.S. citizen and eligible to vote in elections for federal office. Most states right now, that's already on the form. All right. But then submits such other evidence to the appropriate state or local official demonstrating that the applicant is a U.S. citizen. Doesn't say what that other evidence is. Okay, let's go on. Then such official will then make a determination as to whether the applicant has sufficiently established U.S. citizenship for purposes of registering to vote in election for a federal office. Okay. However, big however there. Okay. If that state or local election official makes that determination under the clause above that the applicant who cannot otherwise provide documentary proof of U.S. citizenship has nonetheless sufficiently established U.S. citizenship for purposes of registering to vote in federal elections, such determination shall be accompanied by an affidavit, which will be developed by the EAC, signed by that election official, swearing or affirming that the applicant sufficiently established U.S. citizenship for purposes of registering to vote. Each state shall take affirmative steps on an ongoing basis to ensure that only U.S. citizens are registered to vote, which shall include the establishment of a program for doing so. A state would meet those requirements, okay, by using information supplied by one or more of the following sources, including the Department of Homeland Security's Systematic Alien Verification for Entitlements, known as SAVE. Also, the Social Security Administration's Social Security Number Verification Service. Also, state agencies that issue state IDs or driver's licenses where the agency can confirm U.S. citizenship of applicants, and other sources, okay, which can include databases, whatever, which provide confirmation of U.S. citizenship status. Within 24 hours from the receipt of a request by a state election official, any federal department or agency that possesses information relevant to determining the eligibility of an individual to vote in a federal election shall provide that official with such information. Heads of federal departments and agencies shall share information with each other with respect to an individual who's the subject of that sort of request. Secretary of Homeland Security and the Department of Homeland Security shall conduct an investigation to determine whether to initiate removal proceedings. That's what we, call deportation. If it's determined that an alien is unlawfully registered to vote in election for federal office, and I highlighted registered. That's my emphasis, because it's not just voted in the election, but registered to vote. Federal departments or agencies may not charge a fee for responding to a state's requests. And states shall remove from the official list of eligible voters at any time upon receipt of documentation or verified information that such registrant is not a U.S. citizen. What about folks like me, election officials? Liability. Well, SAVE Act addresses that. Violations may trigger a private right of a civil action against an election official. Okay, it's already in the law, but these are expanded to include registering an applicant to vote where such applicant fails to present documentary proof of U.S. citizenship. I should note to fellow election officials, it's not that you registered a non-citizen, it's that they fail to prove that they're a citizen. They might still be citizens, but they didn't provide the documentary proof. The violation may also trigger criminal prosecution, okay, which would include a federal executive branch officer or employee that provides material assistance to a non-citizen attempting to register to vote. Okay, that's a no-no, along with registering an applicant to vote in a federal election who failed to present the documentary proof of U.S. citizenship. Now, some miscellaneous provisions. Upon receiving information that an individual has become a naturalized U.S. citizen, Secretary of Homeland Security shall promptly provide notice of such information to the appropriate chief election official of the state in which such individual is domiciled. Okay. Also, the Paperwork Reduction Act does not apply with respect to the development or modification of voter registration materials under the National Voter Registration Act, including the development or modification of any voter registration application forms. And the effective date of this act and any amendment made to this act shall be the date of the enactment of the act and shall apply with respect to applications for voter registrations which are submitted on or after that date. So if this is enacted, immediately goes into effect. Okay. Some of the issues I'm just going to throw out there. We'll discuss it amongst our panelists. What are the burdens, the costs, and legal liability that the SAVE Act will impose on individuals? What are the burdens, costs, and legal liability that the SAVE Act will impose on election officials and election agencies? I think a big one here is there really a problem to begin with? Are non-citizens voting in any kind of significant numbers? And it's not saying that's it's a problem if non-citizens are voting, but is this really a problem, or is this a solution in search of a problem? And if it is a problem, does the SAVE Act adequately address the problem? And if it's not a problem, is the SAVE Act even needed? And if it's unknown whether there's a problem or not, how do we determine whether there's a problem or not? Are there better ways of addressing these issues? What are some of the best practices we could maybe implement? And we keep talking about showing birth certificates. Well, what of birthright citizenship? If, in fact, there's no such thing as birthright citizenship, then what does a birth certificate offer as proof of citizenship? Anyway, those are the issues. I'll stop sharing my screen at this point. Whew. There you go. I see a bunch of questions have come in from folks. We're going to hold off on that for right now. I am going to throw this over to my friend and colleague, Patty Ferguson Bonney. Patty, take it away.
Thanks very much, and thanks for providing that background. As a reminder, my name is Patty Ferguson Bonney, and I run the Arizona Native Vote Election Protection Project, just to give you a perspective of my background. And the election issues that I've worked on have focused primarily in Arizona, which has a lot of election activity and has for decades. Primarily, I focus on Native voting issues, and I've litigated a number of cases dealing with access to the ballot for Native people. And so when the SAVE Act was introduced last year, I was looking at it primarily like, how is this going to impact Native voters? But obviously, this has a broader effect. And if people remember, there was an attempt to attach it to a continuing funding resolution last year, and that was unsuccessful. But it has been reintroduced, and there are some plans to vote on it this legislative session. And then I think later in the program, we're going to talk about the executive order. But I just wanted to bring it back to, how do we even get here to the SAVE Act? When the America or the US was created, the goal was really to limit voting to white male property owners. And you can see they have this quote from Winston Churchill that says the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter, because there was a view that only certain people of certain minds and certain status should have the right to vote. But throughout our history, we have expanded the right to vote because that view was wrong, and it is wrong. And we've done that through a number of changes to the Constitution, and also with a number of laws, really starting with the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, which came out of these are the Reconstruction Amendments to make sure that former slaves are citizens and that they have the right to vote. But within that, it really, we have this equal protection clause that is developed, and we ban race-based voter qualifications. In these Reconstruction amendments, they excluded Indians not taxed because Indians were not citizens of the United States, and were recognized as a separate sovereigns, as they are. But we see that over time, the right to vote's expanded through the 19th Amendment, securing the right for women. Poll taxes are abolished. The voting age is lowered to 18. We then have the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 that declares that all Native people are citizens. We have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We have the National Voter Registration Act, which was passed basically to expand voter rights. So we can see that we start with this limited group and then we expand it. And now, since some of the promises of the Voting Rights Act have been reversed, we see that we've moved back to some voter suppression and some ways to reduce voter participation. And in this case, we are trying to say that we're doing this to protect the right to vote, using the word election integrity, but it's really limiting voter participation. And so we have, starting with, the elimination of really exercising Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act when the Supreme Court upended that we have a lot of laws that are being passed really to prevent people from voting. So we have these voter suppression laws that are going into effect, and that went into effect. And when this cartoon was developed, over a decade ago. And at the time I was like, marriage license? Really? Do people need their marriage license to vote? But as you can see with the SAVE Act, you could potentially need your birth certificate with your marriage license to show your name change in order to vote. And so we see that with the documentary proof of citizenship, requirements in Arizona that we have a significant number of people who are impacted by this new law. So Arizona is currently the only state, I think, that has enforced DPOC. There are other states that have been adopting DPOC. But through that, we've seen a number of individuals get caught up in these requirements. And even when people produce the correct requirements for documentary proof of citizenship, for example, if you are a Native person in Arizona, and you provide your tribal ID, that is sufficient for documentary proof of citizenship. During this last election, we had students from across the country who had their tribal IDs, but also some of them provided their birth certificates, and they were still rejected for documentary proof of citizenship in Arizona, because there's a chilling effect whenever you require recorders or people in charge of elections to potentially be subject to criminal prosecution for DPOC. But we had a number of people who registered to vote using their tribal ID, since Native people are citizens and their tribal ID should be sufficient, who their voter registrations were rejected, or they were defaulted to federal only. But under a new SAVE Act, those tribal IDs wouldn't be accepted. I will note, I think Bill referenced this study, but there was a study recently done, I have the link to it below, that showed that over 21 million US citizens currently lack access to their documentary proof of citizenship. So that means that they may not have access to it. It could be in a storage somewhere, or it could be in a different location. And we also have people who just lack access at all. They don't even have the required documents to prove documentary proof of citizenship. And that could be because, we have people who are experiencing wildfires. We have people who are homeless. We have people who have all kinds of circumstances who don't have those documents. And therefore, it's going to be hard to meet this requirement for documentary proof of citizenship. So I say, who are the victims of the SAVE Act? Because this is really like a threat to our democracy. And it really could be anyone. So it could be college students who often move to a different location and they don't carry their birth certificates around with them, and then they want to register to vote. We see that in Arizona with college students who don't have their birth certificates, who are defaulted to the Fed-only list, naturalized citizens who don't update their status to the motor vehicles department, and under some of these processes, they're going to be looking at the Department of Motor Vehicles or other databases, which may not be updated, or they may not be able to copy their documents, things of that nature. Poor people who, don't have access to materials or funds or actual ability to get to these locations, people of color who could be disproportionately impacted, women, and also others who have changed their name. So this could be, it doesn't have to just be women, but if you have to show your name and how your name changed, you still have to show that you were born in the United States. So you need that birth certificate, and you need whatever document that shows that name change. Displaced people, elders, rural Americans who don't have access to these offices that would provide the documents that they need. So, it could really impact anyone, because when you register to vote in elections, they're saying anytime you re-register, so if you have to move, you change your party, you're going to have to show this information again. And so an interesting thing about Arizona is that we have a large number of independents, and they can vote in all of our elections for our state elections. They can pick a party for the primaries, but for the federal elections, you have to be registered with a party. I mean, not federal election, presidential preference, you have to be registered with a party. So a lot of people change their parties so they can vote or they want to participate in the process. And so they would have to show this documentary proof of citizenship. And of course, they can go back through and verify whether you're a citizen, and they may be relying on some outdated databases, which we did see and do see in Arizona. The other thing that I just want to note is the state of Louisiana is one of the states that have adopted this DPOC, and then I think the Real ID Act will be going into effect there, as for, of course, nationwide. But the governor of Louisiana just issued this executive order, state of emergency, basically saying that, they're having a hard time issuing driver's licenses. They have databases that are over 50 years old, programming language over 60 years old, and that they've actually extended the time for people to renew their driver's licenses and their tags and things of that nature because they're just not able to produce them. So if we're making these requirements and requiring this proof, we do have systems and mechanisms that are not working accordingly. So that's very unfortunate, but the burden's going to be on the voter. And I just want to highlight, specific challenges for Native voters. If you look at this picture, this is Hogan on the Navajo reservation, and there's no address here. There's the people who live here don't have utilities. They don't have, they don't receive mail at their home. And this can become challenging for Native voters for a number of reasons. We've represented clients, and there are people in Arizona who were born without being issued a birth certificate. That's not, that doesn't just happen in Arizona and on tribal reservations, but we have higher numbers of people who are born at home and who don't have birth certificates. Our tribal IDs, none of our tribal IDs in Arizona indicate the place of birth, which under the SAVE Act, you would have to include the place of birth. So despite being citizens and being a member of this tribe, proving your citizenship, this would not be sufficient. I've represented tribal people who had a hard time receiving their birth certificates or having their birth certificates accepted because they were delayed birth certificates. Their names had changed multiple times because if you went to boarding school, they may have changed your name and then you didn't like the name, so you pick a new name. So there's a lot, and then you get married. So you could have 3 or 4 changes of names. We also have Native women and other women, but there's a high number of Native women who are subject to domestic violence who may change their name, move, not have access to their personal documents, which can make it hard for them. There's also, we don't have DMVs in Indian country, so this could make it very hard to access documents or access cards, things of that nature. And we really struggle with a lack of home mail delivery. And so communicating about things is difficult. And then a lot of tribal people across the country need language assistance. And I need to emphasize the rural nature of Indian country and the access to these government agencies or locations to either get a birth certificate or an ID, not just in Arizona, but across the country, including Alaska, where people have to take planes to get to, an office to obtain a document. And that seems really unnecessary and an impediment. I just want to mention, because we're talking about changing the motor voter law, and this law was really put in place to make it easier for people to vote, and it was requiring that voter registration actually be accessible, and that we should be allowing people to register to vote at different locations, and has rules on purging voter lists. And so the SAVE Act, would be changing this Motor Voter Act. And there isn't any evidence that this is needed. I've seen no evidence through any litigation that we have, a large number, or in some cases, any non-citizens voting. And actually, the harm is greater to eligible voters and US citizens. And this sort of law is really a threat to our democratic framework, and it's taking us a step back to that earlier slide. I also want to show, just so people can see the federal form for voter registration, it already has an attestation on here that you have to attest that you're a US citizen. It already says on here that I realize that if I am not a US citizen and I don't meet the requirements to vote, that I could be fined, imprisoned, and basically if I'm not a US citizen, I can be deported. And a lot of states have additional laws that you could be subject to if you're not, making it criminal if you're not eligible to vote and you apply to vote. So two other things I just want to mention real quickly, because I think it's important that, with regards to voter qualifications for the state or for federal elections for Congress and the Senate, like this is decided by the state. So these voter qualifications under the Constitution, at least, should be decided by the state. And I just want to point that out. Like the framers of the Constitution looked at this and they decided to give states the authority to set the qualifications. So I wanted to point that out. And I just also wanted to point out the elections clause, that focuses on the time, place, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives are decided by the state. And I think that's important with regards to the EO that we're talk about with regards to when, ballots may be accepted and the timing of it being accepted, that these are described by the state, but Congress can make laws to alter such regulations. So, determining who makes these changes and why, this is subject to the elections clause. So I just wanted to point this out, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay, and this is where I come in and introduce our colleague, Jennifer Morell from the Elections Group, a fantastic consulting firm on elections. So, Jennifer, take it away.
Thank you. Give me a minute to, nope. Sorry, y'all. Okay, we'll do this a different way. I was trying to share so that I could see my notes, but we'll just do it the old-fashioned way. Everybody see that okay? Fantastic. Thanks so much, Bill and Patty and the EBA for inviting me to join you all today. I'm really here not because I have the legal expertise, but I've spent close to 15 years now working in election administration. And so what I hope to do over just the next couple of slides, I think Bill's overview and the information you got from Patty have really helped set the stage for the SAVE Act and the impact that it would have on voters. I'm going to try and give you a few things just to think about in terms of how this might impact election offices, and I hope it will drive conversations and some questions at the end. So Bill asked a really good question at the outset, and that is what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And so I thought it would be helpful. I've seen in the chat a few references to some of the research that's been done around the very few instances of voter fraud that have been identified and prosecuted. But I thought it would be helpful just to do a real quick overview of how voter registration works in most states. First of all, the requirements in the SAVE Act, and we're going to talk, I think, in a little bit about the executive order, focus on that federal form. Patty just showed you a screenshot of that federal form. But most states have a state designed form. And often I will say those forms are better designed and more usable than the national form. States also get to determine what is on that form, what information they collect, what information they don't collect. And I think that's important to note. But every state form I've seen, and I'm going to assume that I always hate when I say like 100% this is how it works, because I get in trouble by folks like you all. But every form I've ever seen has always had that attestation that Patty showed. Are you a citizen of the United States? Are you 18 years or older? Are you eligible? So those eligibility questions, even though states might decide to, for example, ask you to provide your cell phone number or your email address so that they can have a better chance to get in touch with you, all of the paper and online forms I've seen have all had those eligibility requirements. Majority of voters register at the DMV, and that's so important. When I've been out over the last year or so listening and talking to state and local election officials, they remind me that 80% or more of their voters are registering through the DMV and are already providing driver's license numbers or other documentation at the time of registration. We know that a good portion of voters also register online. And in most states, that process has some sort of API built into that online portal that actually requires the voter to enter a valid driver's license number or a social security number. And there's some type of like real-time check or validation of those numbers. I'll also add again that in states with newer, robust state voter registration systems, the election officials, the local election officials that are entering, say, a paper registration or a paper application that's come into their office, often also have the ability to use that API and check as they're doing that registration data entry for a driver's license number or a social security number. When it comes to those online portals, if an online applicant fails that DL or SSN check, if there's not a match, then they are often instructed already to print out that application and mail it into their local election office. And often they're asked, again, depending on the rules and requirements of that state, to provide additional information, or in some states to provide a copy or evidence already of their driver's license. Okay, so I think we've covered in depth, again, between Bill and Patty, what we mean by documentary proof of citizenship. The important thing for election officials, this is a group of individuals that is already understaffed. If you're not aware of some of the challenges that we've had lately when it comes to turnover, when it comes to keeping knowledgeable staff in those positions, this is going to be a pretty significant burden on those officials. So as I mentioned already, about 80% of voters are registering through the DMV. We have about 14% that are registering online. That means those checks, that validation is already happening manually. About 9%, according to 2022, the data set from the EAC, only about 9 or 10% are registering through mail or fax or email. But if we're making some changes and we're saying everybody needs to come in and provide this proof, not only are we adding a pretty significant burden on election officials in terms of the amount of time it's going to take to process these applications, but now we're really putting the burden on them to be document examiners and verifiers. And Bill, I know this is your area of expertise, so I hope you can weigh in on this, but there's, in my mind, a lot of uncertainty around that, a lot of training that potentially would need to be incorporated into this to ensure that when they're looking at a birth certificate or an adoption decree or some other form of identification that's not your normal passport or driver's license, that they can feel confident that they're looking at an authentic, official document. So leave that there. In the SAFE Act, we know that, and Bill went over this, I think, in length about voters who cannot provide proof of citizenship, that they need to submit some other evidence to the election official, who is then going to determine whether it's sufficient. Now, we heard that the EAC is going to be required to create some sort of affidavit that the election official would have to attest to. But again, we're really putting the burden on the election administrator to determine the sufficiency of that other evidence. And it feels to me that there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot still that has not been said or outlined in the act that would leave a gray area for those local election administrators when they're trying to make that determination. And then this is probably the most important part that sort of ties the other two slides together, which is this idea of a criminal penalty. And again, I know I don't need to mention this to folks that are tuning in and watching this, but the last few years have been an incredibly tough and challenging environment for local election officials. You've seen a lot of news about the ongoing threats and harassment, which I should note has decreased somewhat since November of last year, but hasn't gone away. Now we're saying to them, there's this potential that in doing your job, even to the best of your ability, that in making an honest mistake in approving documentation that maybe isn't authentic or allowing for submitted proof that hasn't been clearly defined, you could be subject to criminal penalties. Feels to me like we're just continuing to lay the groundwork for more of these folks to decide this is just a little too much. I don't get paid a lot. And I mean, they don't get paid a lot in many places. You know, it's easy to focus on the large election offices where it is possible in large metro areas. They're getting six-figure salaries, but I will say the majority of election administrators that we work with are somewhere in the $40,000 to $70,000 range. That's not a lot of money for a job that is requiring a lot of time, many hours, overtime that they don't actually get paid overtime for, and now the potential for criminal liability, I think, will continue to hurt us when it comes to retaining good people. Okay, so I mentioned online voter registration. As I mentioned, about 14%, again, looking at the EAC data, of voters are registering online, the rest through the DMV, and only about 9% through mail, fax, or email. The Act requires those who submit the mail voter registration application, that federal application, to submit their proof of citizenship in person at the election office. But it doesn't really talk about or provide clarity on delivery methods for other forms of registration. So if you're registering online, you're not using the mail voter application. What is the method of remedy there? I think the date of enactment, this is kind of a boring thing to think about, but for me, this was the thing that really jumped out at me. Most of our work, as I mentioned, is in the sort of nuts and bolts and logistics of election administration, which is really complex. And so we're saying that on passage, this is going to be effective immediately, and the EAC is going to be required to have guidance for states within 10 days. Just doesn't even seem grounded at all in reality. And it's hard for me to even think about what to say here, but when we think about the complexities, we're talking about all the different ways that a voter can submit a voter registration form. So we're talking about changes and updates to paper forms, to online forms, to the APIs that are used in those forms. We're talking about website instructions for voters that are different in each of the 10,000 jurisdictions. Those all need to be updated. State guidance to voters, the voter outreach and coordination that needs to happen, training for voter registration drive coordinators, training for poll workers, training for those election administrators that are going to be required to be reviewing this documentation. So I think there's a lot that maybe hasn't been thought through when we say that this is going to be enacted immediately. Okay, what are some other things that we need to know? Maybe these are the most important. There is no federal citizenship database. So let's just be clear here. There is a database where you can check for naturalization information. There is a way to check Social Security to ensure that the Social Security number that's been provided is a Social Security number for a person that's alive. But we have no database in the United States that shows all of the citizens that reside here. Patty talked a little bit about Arizona, their bifurcated registration, which is kind of the opposite of this, if I understand it right. You have to provide documentary proof of citizenship for state and local elections, but you can use the federal form or the federal only ballot for federal elections. So when we kind of switch that around and we think about a system or an environment where it is likely that states may not extend these new, if they're passed, federal requirements to state and local elections. I think there are a couple of good examples we can look at. Kansas, I know a couple of years ago, tried to implement a type of like a SAVE Act in Kansas. They blocked roughly 30,000 potential registrants, about 12% of their registered voters. They did concede in court that about 99% of those were eligible citizens. I know in Arizona, Patty, and maybe you can talk more about this later, there were some challenges last year with the state's motor vehicle division because of this bifurcation, these two different sets of requirements for registering applicants. And so that's one of those complexities that I mentioned. I think they're relevant to the SAVE Act, also will be very relevant to the executive order that we'll talk about in a minute. And then the last thing here is just this focus on real IDs. Just a reminder to everybody that compliant real IDs are available to non-citizens. You do have to provide proof that you have lawful status, so you're lawfully eligible to be in the country, but that doesn't necessarily mean you are a citizen. And yeah, there's probably not a whole lot more to say about that. I guess the other thing, I think everybody's aware that there are some local elections, some local jurisdictions where school board elections or other local elections are opened to non-citizens. Let's put it that way. We can talk more about that if there's an interest. Okay, last thing for me, because I know we need to get moving. The best way to ensure the cleanliness and accuracy of our voter rolls and the security of our elections more broadly is to make sure that state and local election officials have appropriate funding. I could spend the next 30 minutes just talking about this. We still have states that have old, aging infrastructure when we talk about their statewide voter database. We still have local officials that are not using all of the technology that is available either to communicate with that database or to communicate with voter registration or Department of Motor Vehicle offices in real time, simply because they don't have the resources or the funding to do that. We still have, we didn't even get into same-day voter registration and some of the requirements there, but in states that allow for same-day voter registration, often they do have a real-time connection to the state database to check eligibility and other things before they register individuals. That is that is part of the solution, is having more options to register folks. There are still plenty of jurisdictions that I've done work in where they're still doing everything manually and on paper, again, because they don't have the money to do that. And then more importantly, a lot of the conversation around funding, federal funding, state funding, we focus a lot on the hardware, the equipment, all of those things are so important. But where we still have a huge gap is in the funding of the humans. this workforce across the board is understaffed. I've not been in a single election office, large or small, that has enough staff to adequately meet the demands and needs that are placed on them. So we should be, as we're talking about the legalities of this law, we're talking about the legalities of the election, the executive order, and the logistics. We also should be talking about the costs. And I will stop sharing. Bill, back over to you.
Back to me. Thank you. Go back to my radio days. Thank you, Jennifer. As we've been mentioning just yesterday, how brilliant is the ABA in timing today's webinar? You know, just yesterday, the president signed an executive order that deals with a lot of this and some other things as well. But before we do, I'm going to take moderator's privilege here and just say a couple of things. Bouncing off of things that Patty and Jennifer was right. Patty is with Arizona State University, the largest university in the United States. And I know our experience here in Chicago is very often Illinois allows same-day voter registration and voting. The numbers that we get around our universities where the students show up. I mean, I don't know about you folks, but when I went off to college, bringing my birth certificate was not number one in my mind, you know. And they show up, and very often the first time they voted, and they want to register that day and vote. And this is going to cause a big problem with college students not having that. And as I say, we do allow in Illinois same-day registration. In the city of Chicago alone, we have on election day about 1,300 precincts. Under this law, we're going to have to train someone in all 1,300 on how to recognize what a real ID card from another state looks like, what a birth certificate from another state looks like, et cetera, et cetera. And Jennifer points out the real ID are being issued to non-citizens, real ID driver's licenses. And plus, here in Chicago, up at our beautiful O'Hare Field, last few months, almost every month, the good people in customs are confiscating shipments of over 1,000 counterfeit real IDs that are coming through, mostly for college students trying to get into bars before they're 21. But has to make you wonder about the reliability of the real ID. So just some of the problems that this legislation might bring up. So as long as we have this opportunity, let's talk about yesterday's executive order. And I'm going to try and get this up there so I'm not blocking people's screens and all that good stuff. So let me see what I can do here. And getting my slides up on that. I'm not used to this because usually my students, when I use this, don't want to see my face. So let's see what we can do. Let's put, oh, maybe I can do it this way. How about this? Oh, look at that. Let's try it this way. Okay. Can you see my slide now? Let's see. Oops. Okay. Am I still on the screen or not? I can't tell. Okay. Let me go back. Okay. The executive order on this was the name of it, Preserving and Protecting the Integrity of American Elections, and it was signed by the president yesterday. Number one, changes to the National Mail Voter Registration Form. The EAC, again, the Election Assistance Commission, is to make the following changes to the National Mail Voter Registration Form. One, to require documentary proof of United States citizenship, defined as a U.S. passport, real ID that indicates U.S. citizenship, official military ID that indicates U.S. citizenship, A valid, whoops, 1 second there. Ooh, it went away. A valid federal or state government issued photo identification that indicates U.S. citizenship or, quote, otherwise accompanied by proof of U.S. citizenship. 2, require a state or local official to record on the registration form the type of document provided, as proof of citizenship, including the issuance date, the expiration date, the office that issued the document, and any unique identification number associated with the document. Additionally, the executive order gave access to federal systems for citizenship verification. So, Department of Homeland Security, DHS, is to ensure that state and local officials have access, and as an election official, very important, without fee, to appropriate systems for verifying the citizenship or immigration status of individuals who are either registering to vote or who have already been registered to vote. Additionally, the State Department is to make available to state and local election officials information from, quote, relevant database for verifying the citizenship of, again, individuals registering to vote or those who are already registered to vote. Department of Homeland Security is to review state voter registration lists in coordination with the DOGE administrator. They shall review each state's publicly available voter registration list and available records concerning voter list maintenance activities. Comparing that alongside the federal immigration database and state records requested, including giving them the power to subpoena records where necessary and authorized by law in order to find consistency with these federal requirements. Now, immigration forms indicating registration or voting. So DHS is to provide to the Department of Justice information on all foreign nationals who have indicated on any immigration form that they've registered to vote or that they have voted in a federal, state, or local election, and they shall submit this information also to state or local election officials. The executive order also says that each federal voter registration executive department or agency under the National Voter Registration Act shall assess citizenship prior to providing federal voter registration form to enrollees of public assistance programs. So before signing someone up for a public assistance program, you have to access this. Access and assess. Okay. Now then, it also gives an enforcement role to the Department of Justice. The executive order states that the DOJ is to prioritize enforcement of federal laws, quote, that restrict non-citizens from registering to vote or voting, including the use of databases and information maintained by the Department of Homeland Security, state-issued ID card and driver's license databases, and similar records relating to citizenship. Furthermore, DOJ is to coordinate with state attorneys general to assist with state-level review and prosecution of aliens who are unlawfully registered to vote or who have cast votes. Further, the providing of assistance to states verifying eligibility, the Social Security Administration is going to be required to, one moment here, what am I supposed to click here? Oh, there we go. How about that? Okay. Social Security Administration is required to make available to state and local election officials information including the Social Security number verification system, the death master file, and, quote, any other federal databases containing relevant information. Then the Department of Justice is to take appropriate action with respect to states that fail to comply with the list maintenance requirements of the NVRA and the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA. The Department of Defense is to update the federal postcard application to require documentary proof of U.S. citizenship, as listed above, and proof of eligibility to vote in elections in the state where the individual is attempting to vote. Oops. Okay. Then the Election Assistance Commission, in accordance with this executive order, is being told that they are to terminate funding to states that do not comply with the federal laws set forth in 52 U.S.C. 21145, including the acceptance and use of the National Mail Voter Registration Form, and including those requirements for documentary proof of U.S. citizenship pursuant to this executive order. The EAC is to amend the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines, known as VVSG 2.0, including prohibiting voting systems from using ballots which contain a barcode or QR code for vote counting, except where necessary to accommodate individuals with disabilities, and requiring voting systems to provide a voter verifiable paper record. Further, the EAC is to review and, if appropriate, recertify voting systems under the new standards established by this executive order, and to rescind all previous certifications of voting equipment based on prior standards. And EAC is to audit HAVA fund expenditures, report any discrepancies or issues with an audited state's certifications of compliance with federal law, and report those to the Department of Justice for, quote, appropriate enforcement action. Department of Homeland Security and FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, in considering funding for state or local election offices or administrators through the Homeland Security Grant Program shall, quote, heavily prioritize compliance, end quote, with the EAC's VVSG 2.0 completion of testing through the Voting System Test Labs accreditation process. Department of Justice is going to be, this EO goes to prosecution of election crimes. DOJ is to enter into information sharing agreements with the, quote, chief state election official or multi-member agency of each state. The agreements are to provide the DOJ with detailed information on all suspected violations of state and federal election laws discovered by state officials, including information on individuals who registered or voted despite being eligible, or registered multiple times, should be registered or voted despite being ineligible, committed election fraud, provided false information on voter registration or other election forms, intimidated or threatened voters or election officials, or otherwise engaged in unlawful conduct interfering in the election process. States unwilling to enter into such an information sharing agreement, or who refuse to cooperate in investigations and prosecution of election crimes, to those states, the DOJ will prioritize enforcement of federal election integrity laws in such states and review for potential withholding of DOJ grants to states and local governments for law enforcement and other purposes. Additionally, so long as Department of Homeland Security continues to designate election infrastructure as critical infrastructure, the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security shall prevent non-citizens from being involved in the administration of any federal election. So non-citizens, you can't be involved in elections, including by accessing election equipment, ballots, or any other relevant materials used in the conduct of federal elections. DHS and EAC are to review and report on the security of all electronic systems used in the voter registration and voting process, including to the extent they are connected to or integrated into the internet. Report on the risk of the systems being compromised through malicious software and unauthorized intrusion into the system. And again, expanding on the SAVE Act, this executive order goes into the National Election Day, stating that the Department of Justice shall take actions against states that include absentee or mail-in ballots received after Election Day in the final tabulation of votes for the appointment of presidential electors and the election of members of Congress. The EAC shall condition funding to a state on the state's adopting, quote, uniform and non-discriminatory standards that define what constitutes a vote and what will be counted as a vote, end quote, including a ballot receipt deadline of Election Day for all methods of voting, excluding ballots cast in accordance with UOCAVA, after which no additional votes may be cast. The DOJ, in consultation with the Treasury Department, shall prioritize enforcement laws to prevent foreign nationals from contributing or donating in the United States elections, and the DOJ shall likewise prioritize enforcement of laws which prohibit lobbying by organizations or entities that have received any federal funds. And then it goes to federal actions to address the Executive Order 14019. The heads of all agencies and the EAC, quote, I'll just quote this, shall cease all agency actions implementing Executive Order 14019 of March 7, 2021, called the Promoting Access to Voting, which was revoked by Executive Order 14148 of January 20, 2025, which was called the Initial Rescissions of Harmful Executive Orders and Actions. And within 90 days, submit to the President a report describing compliance with this part of the order. And that's it for me on that. Let me close this out, stop sharing. Okay, sorry if I ran through that. I think maybe my panelists wanted to say something, but I couldn't see you. I'm still having problems at my end. But there you go, folks. That's the executive order. Patty or Jennifer, you want to weigh in? Jennifer?
Ooh, we've got 10 minutes. First of all, before we even think about this, I think it's important just to think about how we change rules and requirements and laws around voting in this country. We have a Congress, we have state legislators. This, I think, is an important thing to focus on is why are we having an executive order? But let me just go to the sharing of information, documentary proof of citizenship, federal sharing of information. Look, we had a really great system a few years ago. About half of the states were members of something called ERIC, the Electronic Election Registration Information Sharing Center, where if you were a member, you had access to the National Change of Address files, the Social Security Master Death Index. You could share information with member states about who was registering and unregistering. And so I think, I don't know of any election office that would turn down free access to the information that is being proposed in this order. But there's some things that need to happen. We know, again, the SAFE, if you go to SAVE, the online service for checking citizenship status, that's not easily accessible. This is not something that states right now currently can import into their voter registration system. So I think there's some work to be done there. But I think that's actually one area where most people would say, sure, if we can have access to this freely, we will take you up on that. Couple important things you mentioned, Bill, the change to the VVSG 2.0 and the decertification of voting equipment. This one really has me scratching my head. One, again, there is a process. The EAC is an independent agency. That's really important as well, too. And if we have time, we can get into that. But they've got a committee, a technical advisory committee that sets these voting, the standards for certifying voting equipment. They meet regularly, they update, review those. They make sure that the testing labs are in compliance. If this were to go into effect, if this does go into effect, this provision, again, that doesn't come with any funding to support it, would force some or all of the counties in Delaware, Georgia, Louisiana, South Carolina, Arkansas, California, Idaho, Illinois, and potentially others to completely replace their voting system. So this, again, shows to me that there wasn't a lot of thought or research in putting that mandate in there. I guess we can talk about the ballots. All ballots have to be turned in on election day. Again, there's a whole list of states that would be impacted by that.
Yeah.
Patty, go ahead. I'm looking at my notes. There's so many things here.
Patty, while we're waiting for Jennifer, you have any input?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, blow my mind. But what a thorough unconstitutional overreach. I think that we should just say that because that's what this is. I'm sure that it's going to be litigated. I think Ryan put in the chat, he works for Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, that this, the EAC is an independent agency, but it has to follow the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act. There's also laws in place with regards to the national mail voter registration form, which I put in the chat. And it says what should be included on that form. Includes a statement that specifies the eligibility requirement, including citizenship and attestation that you meet the requirement, the signature. And it basically says you can only require such identifying information and other information as is necessary to enable the appropriate state to assess the eligibility of the applicant and to administer voter registration. So, I mean, that's in law. The president cannot change the law through this executive order. That's Congress's job to do that, in addition to challenges which could be under the 14th Amendment or the Voting Rights Act. So I think that that's very important to recognize, but challenging things also take time. So I think that it's very concerning that there's been at least one Secretary of State in Arizona, for example, who has sent this executive order out to the county officials without saying I'm not really sure, like maybe he said just for your information, but I mean, I think sending this out without other information is challenging. It also, I mentioned there are these other provisions of the U.S. Constitution dealing with the elections clause and voter eligibility requirements, which fall on states. So, and only Congress can change those, not the president. And again, this doesn't allow for tribal IDs to be used as proof of citizenship. So if they're going back and they're going to be checking databases and, it's not clear what they can, how they're going to check against. But we know in Arizona, a lot of tribal members use their tribal IDs as proof of citizenship, and that would have been on their form. So if this was actually implemented, would these people be removed? So, just like those are some of my basic thoughts.
Yeah. I don't think there's any doubt that this executive order will be challenged for constitutionality. I know late yesterday here in Illinois, our governor issued a statement on it. Illinois, just the provisions about the national election day and not counting ballots received after election day. Illinois allows the counting of ballots received up to 14 days following election day. It's one of the longest out there. As long as they are postmarked by or before election day. And you'd be amazed how many ballots we get in that are postmarked. It just takes that long, up to 2 weeks for us to receive it mailed somewhere in the U.S. So there's that. I'm sure this is going to be challenged for constitutionality on a number of grounds. Somebody in chat, I'm going to look at some of the questions that have come through. Thankfully, we have sort of answered a bunch of them in our discussions. Allie has also answered some, I see. In fact, one came through as about if a woman gets married and changes her name, what happens there? We do know there was a case, New Hampshire has a law requiring the showing of birth certificates, and there was recently a local election where a woman came in to vote and she was denied voting in a local election because she didn't bring in her marriage certificate to show the change of name. So this is, this is going to be very problematic to anyone who's changed their name by court order or by marriage. So we're going to have to, in addition to going out and getting our birth certificates, which in Cook County, Illinois, is $15 each. Marriage certificate also, or marriage, certificate $15. So, I mean, to what extent is that a poll tax? Another question for the
Wait,
courts.
I just want to note that, what we saw in the MVD glitch in Arizona was that there were a number of people who they identified as maybe they didn't provide proof of citizenship. And this could happen also with people who go in and they have their name changes and they take care of it at a certain time when they get their IDs but they may not maintain that list. And so they're looking at a list for some
Right.
reason, but it doesn't mean that these people haven't provided documentary proof of citizenship. And that's what we saw in the Arizona case. The information may not have been maintained. And so someone who's already provided that to change their driver's license or ID may have to provide that again.
Just looking at the questions here, one is, would the affidavit serve as adequate proof of citizenship? If not, the election official probably will not sign the, attesting to adequate proof is provided. Probably not, especially if you might be prosecuted for approving that. So the affidavit is not that effective. Prospects of defeating this, the SAVE Act in Congress, I leave that up to the political pundits. I'm not going to get in on that. Aside from the inoperability, costs, and waste from this law, what about states' rights and federal overreach? Yeah, I think there's a big constitutional question there as far as federalism and what states can do in running their own elections, et cetera. Patty, I may have missed it, but is there any talk of class action on behalf of Native peoples and real ID requirements? Patty, do you want to weigh in on that?
No, I haven't heard that because until this EO came out, I think the places where they have DPOC, which was Arizona, some other places are joining, but you could use your tribal ID. And so that was litigated and, the state agreed to it and the parties agreed to it, that of course, tribal people should be able to use their tribal IDs.
Okay.
But yeah, I haven't heard about that.
And a question from Kitty Kurth about the EO speaking about tribal IDs. No, it doesn't speak to, I think we've mentioned that. It only speaks of state and federally issued IDs, not tribal IDs. So apparently wouldn't work there. If I may take my moderator privilege again, I came across something, and I'm going to try and share this if I can where'd it go? Where is it? I've lost my.
And Bill, I think Jennifer has to leave.
Oh, Jennifer.
So I don't know
Jennifer,
if she has something to add.
do you have to leave, or do you need something to add?
I do have, I call it the top of the hour, but two quick thoughts on the affidavit. Just a reminder to everybody that we already have voters sign an affidavit under penalty of perjury that they meet all of the qualifications to vote. And then on the executive order, just drawing everyone's attention to this requirement for DOJ and DHS to review voter registration files and list maintenance activities for consistency. This is going to, I think, lead to a lot of public sharing of misinformation. I'm happy to talk with folks one-on-one about some of those challenges. I also think there's a real potential for significant privacy and security risks of those departments identifying, personally identifying information. So take a look. I encourage everyone to take a closer look at that part of the EO. That's it. And so grateful to be here with all of you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm just going to close out real quickly with This is something I just came across yesterday from March 9, 1954. A statement by Edward R. Murrow, who has kind of got a renaissance due to the play on Broadway starring George Clooney. And in fact, Jennifer and I were at the National Press Club just before the election, and they have the microphone there that Edward R. Murrow used during his broadcast during the war, World War II from London. And here's the quote from him.
It is necessary to investigate before legislating.
It's necessary to investigate before legislating. There are a lot of our fellow Americans out there who are, in fact, concerned, citizens of good faith, who are concerned about waves of non-citizens voting because they've been told of this. And yet there's no evidence apparently out there to prove that. I think, as Murrow suggests, before we legislate, let's investigate. And it's funny, the SAVE Act sort of suggests a way in that, let's look at the roles that we have now. We can audit them. And, I'm an auditing professor. I'm the president of the Institute of Election Auditors. So there's my, statement of potential conflict. Let's audit those. How about this? How about requiring on registration forms that people list where they were born? We already have the date of birth. Let's put in where they were born, and if they've changed their name, when did they change it, by marriage or whatever, and then have election officials randomly sample and test to see if we have significant numbers of non-citizens voting. And if we don't, fine, then we don't need to go any further. We will know, we can convince our fellow citizens that this kind of action is only burdensome and potentially disenfranchising. If it does show a problem, okay, then we can go further. And if nothing else, the fact that audits, as we know who teach auditing is a great way of deterring noncompliance. If people think that they might get caught, they're not going to do it. So I think there are better ways to get at this issue, get at this problem. And I think the first is to find out whether we have a problem at all, or as I said at the beginning, is this a solution in search of a problem? I see we're out of time. And so I want to thank, unfortunately, Jennifer Morrell, very busy person, had to leave us, but definitely thank Patty Ferguson Bonney for joining us, and thank the folks at the Civil Rights and Social Justice section of the ABA and Ali Kielsgaard, and at the Standing Committee of Election Law, especially Jacob Rash. And I thank you all for watching and participating, and keep the faith, people. Take care.